Every abortion survivor we see walking around is living testimony to the humanity of the unborn. And I think about just like when we talk about slavery, when we talk about the Holocaust, all those sorts of things, some of the most moving parts of that was to show the reality of that, to show their survivors, to show what they went through, to highlight their stories, to share their stories so that we don't repeat those mistakes.
Welcome to Straight Talk on Life Issues. I'm Victor Nieves, president of Life Issues Institute. Abortion doesn't always go as planned, thankfully. Babies escape abortion more often than many people realize. The survivors of abortion are living testimonies to the fact that the unborn baby in the womb is, in fact, a human being. Their stories are an undeniable proof that that baby deserves life. Today, our guest will share the circumstances surrounding his birth, and his story is surprising and very compelling. We're joined by Josiah Presley. Since 2013, Josiah has been sharing his story with churches, schools, pro-life groups, and pregnancy resource centers such as the Abortion Survivors Network, the Family Research Council, Focus on the Family, and many more. Well, Josiah, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Victor.
You have quite the story, and it's been spoken before audiences now, I think, around the world. A very compelling story. Briefly, just share that with our listener.
Yeah, I'm adopted from South Korea. I grew up here in the States. I was adopted when I was 13 months old from a big adopted family. I'm one of 12 kids, 10 of us being adopted. Big part of my story is when I was 13 years old, my adopted parents, they told me about my adoption story and some more details about it. And they told me about how my mom, 2 months into her pregnancy with me in South Korea, where I was born, she actually decided to have a D&C abortion. The abortion failed. A few months later, she realized that I was still very much so alive. And so I was kept and then born later on that year and placed for adoption and lived in a foster home for about a year before I was adopted and brought over to the States and raised as a Presley. And so a lot of my journey is struggling with self-image and self-worth issues as a child because of a deformity I have. I have a deformed left arm. And then that struggle increased as I learned more about this part of my story as a young teenager. And then as I was on that journey of figuring out what that meant for me as far as my worth, my value, my identity, my purpose, ultimately being solidified about the age of 16, 17 when I surrendered my life to Jesus and started a relationship with him and began to find my identity and my value, my worth in who he is. As I did that, a lot changed for my life. My outlook on life changed. My security changed, not in who I was or what I did, but in who my Savior was. I found forgiveness towards my birth parents. And through that, I was able to begin sharing my story. And so I've been doing that for a number of years now, particularly as a pro-life advocate, an advocate for life for the unborn, to see people hopefully recognize their worth and value and recognize the role we have to protect life.
And you have, because of your story, a unique ability as a pro-life advocate. We know that there's actually a lot more people who do survive abortions than what many people would think. What has been the response? I'm curious, specifically from the pro-abortion side. When you tell them your story, you stand before them as an example of the humanity of the child in the womb. It's undeniable. What have they said in response to that?
Yeah, so I've actually found it whenever I'm dialoguing or talking with somebody who is on the other side of the argument, I try my best to leave my story out in that dialogue for as long as I can in the conversation. Because I found in my experience, whenever I bring up this part of my story and the reality of being an abortion survivor, it tends to shut down the dialogue because there very rarely is much response that they do have in reality. And so I actually, if we're trying to change minds and change hearts, I try to dialogue for as long as I can without bringing that part of my story into it, because once I do that, and a lot of times the conversation kind of ends there because there isn't a good response to that. They can't justify it then. Their arguments aren't as compelling and they are suddenly confronted with the humanity and the reality of it. Oftentimes, I found in my conversations.
Wow. So it's just such a powerful testimony. They literally don't have anything to say.
Typically, yeah.
Wow. So, how about on the other end? I mean, I'm sure you've seen people who are receptive to your story, maybe somebody
Yep.
who's not all the way in the pro abortion camp, but somebody who's kind of like middle of the road. They're still making up their mind.
Yep.
When they hear your story, when they dialogue with you and you make the case for life, what's their response been?
So a lot of the speaking I really do is I do a lot with churches and then even pregnancy centers. That's the majority of the speaking I do. So we have a lot of people who are for life, and then we have a lot of people who are like, they know they're supposed to be, but they're not really sure if they are or what it looks like or what that entails. And so a lot of times in those conversations, I hope I'm able to really help them recognize the importance of that belief and understanding the value of human life, and then a call to action and say, okay, and I have a responsibility to do something about it, and to care and to be involved, and to do some sort of part in it. And so a lot of times when I have conversations with folks on that side, it usually goes one of a couple of ways. Either there's a bit of a, wow, I knew, but I didn't really realize what we're talking about here. And now there's almost sort of this responsibility that they recognize of like, wow, no, we are really talking about human lives here, who we say are valuable. And not only is it we say they're valuable, but now I know, and maybe I didn't know before, but now I know, and now I have a responsibility to do something about it. So I think there's oftentimes a bit of that response. I think there's also a lot of times a response of, man, yeah, like I believe these things, I've cared about these, but maybe there needs to be some shifts that take place, right? I need to rethink a little bit what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, my motivations, what ways I'm engaging. And so those are typically kind of the two responses I tend to see when I talk with people who are concerned themselves pro life, or at least, concern themselves more thinking that direction.
Let me ask this. Going back, you said you found out when you were age 13 that you were an
Mm-hmm.
abortion survivor. In
Yeah.
that moment, what's going through your head? What's on your heart when you find that out?
Yeah. So, I mean, I was very thankful my parents told me that part of my story. Just as an adopted child, it constantly wanting to know, more about our story. Where do we come from? Things like that. And so I was thankful for that because it is part of my story. And as an adopted kid, you don't always get all the pieces. You don't have all the pieces, And so thankful for that. For me, there's a lot of hurt though, and there's a lot of anger. Those would be the two primary responses I'd really say there were at that time in my life. A lot of it stemmed from the reality that I knew the truth about abortion. I grew up in a very pro-life, very Christian home, and we knew that abortion was wrong, and we held a pro-life ethic. And it's one I hadn't cared about very much at that point, but I knew those truths. And so there's a lot of hurt for me at the time because I was already struggling with my value, my worth. Do I belong here? Should I even be here? And so there's hurt because I had proof that I shouldn't be in my mind, because my birth parents, my own flesh and blood, people should love me the most, they tried to take my life. Like that's how worthless they seemed to think it was. So it obviously had no value. So there's a lot of pain on that side. There's also, though, a lot of what that hurt. There's a lot of anger because, again, I knew the truth. I knew that abortion was wrong. How could they not know? Or how could they make such wrong decisions? Surely they knew it was wrong. How could they do something like that? That would leave me the way I was, broken in my eyes less than others. I blamed my deformity on them in that decision. And so there's hurt and anger. Those two, I would say, were the pervading emotions or feelings I had and responses I had through that. I mean, those were things that I dealt with for a number of years. And again, I'd say it wasn't until I came to salvation in Jesus, I found my identity and worth and value in Him, that those really began to change in my life.
And at 13, Josiah, I mean, that's a tricky time for anybody. That's
Yeah,
just a time in your life
yeah.
where you have a lot going on anyway. And so having that, the hurt that was resting on you, and some of the anger, what are ways that that impacted you just as a teenager going through that time in your life?
Yeah, so I mean, definitely, like, again, I was struggling with value and worth and depression. So there was deeper layers of that now that I definitely struggled with. As I then began to look at what it meant to be pro-life and cared about what it meant to be pro-life, I started to be more involved in it. But there really wasn't love or kindness behind it. There's a lot of anger behind it. I did a lot of demonizing people on the other side of the argument, because of it. And so as I took on a us versus them mentality, it definitely showed up in the way I engaged on the issue. I mean, that's for a number of years, just working through that, processing that on my own. A lot of it was coming from a Christian background, I knew the Christian thing to do was to forgive. And so I definitely said I forgave, but there really were no signs of it. And I would say in my own heart, there really was no forgiveness until I found forgiveness in Jesus. So to go with having a deformed arm, I was a scrawny, acne-faced middle school boy. And so, life was a little difficult anyways. So.
Yeah, I can imagine. Everybody has been at that age before. They know exactly what you're talking about. So I'm curious, what are some of the things you mentioned how you went through healing and you found forgiveness in Christ? What were some of the things that helped you in that healing journey? Was it friends, family, maybe a church community? What helped get you through that?
Yeah, so a lot of it definitely was my parents. My parents loved me, my siblings very well. And so seeing that reality and their lives lived out, and I think there's a close tie, I believe, between earthly adoption and our heavenly adoption as children of God. And so when I came to faith in Jesus, began a relationship with him, understood my value to my creator and his love for me, particularly through adoption and salvation, all of that I understood better because of the example of love and adoption I had in the earthly picture of my adopted parents. And so as I began to recognize the implications of salvation through Jesus on my life, I understood those implications better because of the earthly picture I had of it through my parents. And so that was a major part of it. A lot of it was the church I grew up in. Grew up in a very strong, biblically based church. And so as I understood the gospel better and deeper, I would say I understood a number of things deeper. I understood in a greater way Christ's forgiveness of me, his forgiveness towards me when I had rebelled against him. And so that call then for us to forgive others because Christ has forgiven us. And so I found forgiveness towards my parents in that as I recognized the depth of Christ's forgiveness towards me. The idea of loving others and the calling that we have to love others because of the love Christ has displayed towards us. Again, as I understood that at a greater level and at a deeper level, it then worked its way back in my life as to how I loved and cared for others and recognized the importance of doing that well. And not just caring and loving one segment of the population, the unborn, but all segments of the population, the born as well, my born neighbors, and not just those around me, but even those who by worldly standards we would consider our enemies. Those were major factors in my life that impacted me.
And that's an encouragement too, I think, to all of the pastors who are out there. You never know who's in your congregation. You never know what impact you could be having. But like you said, that strong church community really made a huge difference in your life as it went on. Josiah, I also want to ask you, we often hear when the topic of abortion is debated, discussed, we see that it's framed around women's rights. We hear an awful lot about women's rights. What about the baby's rights? Do you have any suggestion on how we frame the conversation around the life of the child in the womb?
Yeah, so I think a big piece we have to consider, it's not a women's right issue, it's a human rights issue. And so we have to consider, and what we have to do is we have to decide, okay, so when is a human, right? When do we decide that a human being is a human being? For the most part, I think we can all agree that humans are valuable. Humans should be protected, humans should be cared for, whether male or female, whatever background or ethnicity or socioeconomic status they're born into or they find themselves in, political party, whatever you want to say, we can usually all find the common ground that human beings are valuable and should be protected and cared for, I think, and should have rights. The question that has to be answered is, when does a human become a human? Now, from a pro-life perspective, from a biological perspective, from really any legitimate perspective you want to look at, the obvious answer should be from conception. That is not the case and not what we find in our society. And because of that, we find people who are willing and able to then say, well, a human doesn't become a human until these factors occur or those factors occur. And the problem that we create when we do that is we start moving the line on what makes a human a human. And when we start doing that, we make it really easy to justify some pretty horrendous things. Abortion is a very horrendous thing, but I think about even just a number of years ago, it was a major thing in the news outlets in Virginia when they, a governor saying when a baby's born, conversation would then be entered into whether or not that child should be allowed to live or not. And there's a lot of backlash to that from both sides. A lot of people going, whoa, what's going on here? Like, since when is that okay? Since when is that what we're about when we talk about women's rights? And it's like, well, it's not hard to get there, we're talking about just a matter of a few minutes and a change of location, and all of a sudden we're there. And from a pro life perspective, we say, yeah, because you've allowed it in the womb, why would you not allow it outside of the womb? Because you've allowed it right up until this point, why would you not allow it just beyond this point? And what we have to come back to is like, what makes a human being? And at what point are the humans that we should value and care for? And from a pro life perspective, every time we're going to say from conception.
You have highlighted oftentimes the pro-abortion side will try to move the goalpost. It's a very dangerous game to play. It's been done historically. Anytime you start to acknowledge that, yeah, they're a human, but they're not really a person, you
Yeah.
get into very dangerous territory of genocide. You get into slavery. You get into all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
That same basic premise has been used to justify many of the atrocities that we've seen. We are not humans because of what we can do. We are humans because of what we are. And we are humans at the very moment of conception. As you've gone and you've spread the pro-life case, do you have any favorite stories to share with us? Times that were really impactful, maybe a conversation that you had with someone who is undecided on our side, even on the other side. I'm sure you've run into so many interesting scenarios as you've done this work. Do you have any favorites?
Yeah, three of my favorite types of stories to hear. I'll tell you, I don't know how many times I've finished speaking and I've had a woman come up to me afterwards, and she's a post-abortive woman, and she talks about how she had an abortion and how that devastated her for so many years. And that's not my favorite part of the story. My favorite part of the story is when they then share about how they were connected with Pregnancy Center. They were connected with somebody who does, a forgiven and set free type course to help them process that and bring that out into the light and find forgiveness and redemption there. And I love to hear those stories because it reminds me of their humanity and their value. It reminds me of the pro-life work to care for all human beings, but it also reminds me of the goodness and kindness of God, that he forgives and he restores. And that's what we're about. So I love to hear those stories. I love to hear stories, honestly, of, I would say, great courage and heroism of family members or of young people who have found themselves in a crisis pregnancy situation, and they did choose life and they fought for their child. And it was difficult and it wasn't easy, but they gave that child life. And then sometimes they'll be there and they'll be like, and this is a kid, and they'll have this, young child with them. And that child's there because they lived in a culture that said, hey, just get rid of it. But they said, no, we're going to care for and love this child. And to see that beautiful life there, I love to see those stories. And I love to see, probably the third type of story I'd say I love to hear and see are of students, young people who have taken up the cause and who've done some really remarkable things for life. And just to see them get it, understand it, and say, you know what, and we're not going to leave it off for the adults. We're going to take up that mantle and we're going to protect and defend life. And it's a really beautiful thing to see even among this, I'd say, movement, because there are so many opportunities for people to rise up and to care for those around them and to show really what it looks like to love our neighbors and to literally save lives. And there's, a lot of losses we see in it, but there's also a lot of moments where we see people rise to that occasion. We see God use them in mighty ways.
Absolutely. And Josiah, I'm curious, as you've traveled and you've shared your story, speaking specifically of the young people, it's been a big encouragement to me that I've just seen anecdotally a lot of my peers. I'm seeing a shift. Are you seeing a large percentage of young people getting engaged, becoming on fire really for defending life? Because I'm seeing it and I'm hopeful that everyone else is seeing it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I see it. I mean, I think you talk about Alpha and the Gen Z generations, they're generations that they want a cause. They have strong beliefs about social justice and wanting to see that. And so I think there's an impetus on us to show them that this is the cause of our generation. This is the most pressing matter in our generation. This is the most pressing atrocity of our generation that needs to be tackled, and to just let them see it, understand it. And man, yeah, they're on fire and they're moving on it. And we're seeing that in this generation, that they want a cause. They want to see change. They grew up in a world that they've seen is broken, is messed up. And to see like, hey, I can do something about it. I want to do something about it. And so if we can show them the reality of it and point them in the direction, I mean, it's crazy to see what they do with it.
And what's your encouragement maybe to someone who wants to get involved, but they have not yet picked up their torch? They haven't yet gotten into the fight all the way, but they want to. What's your encouragement to them?
I'd say start by just knowing what it is you're looking at, right? knowing your belief on the matter, knowing why you believe it, the importance of that belief. Search it out. Search out, if you're a Christian, search out what God's word says on the matter and allow that to shape your thinking on that. And then as your thinking is shaped on that, let that turn into action and just ask God, like, what is it you'd have me do? And be willing to do it and do something. Just find some way to start working at it. Find some way to engage. Maybe it's just as simple as starting a single conversation, but do something with it and see where God wants to take it and be faithful to take the next step and the next step and see what he can do with it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, you know, a lot of times we have the best intentions, but we imagine to get involved and to do something, we have to go to the White House or we
Yeah.
have to be a member of Congress or
Yeah.
something. The truth of it is, it starts one conversation at a time.
Yeah.
Every single person has a sphere of influence. You've got friends, family members, coworkers, a church community. You never know what those people
Yeah.
could be going through. You never know what could be on their mind.
Yeah.
And then when you think about it in an exponential way, every single one of them has a circle just like you do. And one person's voice very quickly can cascade, and it can
Yeah.
be a very big difference maker. And I'm sure that you've seen that quite
Yeah.
often. A follow-up question I have for you is, what would you say to someone right now who is considering having an abortion?
Man, I tell them first, you need to recognize your value as a human being. Like, I don't know what the situation is that has put you in this place where you're thinking that's what you need to do to fix whatever's going on in your life. I want them to hear like they are valuable and they are loved and they are worthy as a human being. I'd also want them to know that that life inside of them, and it is a life, it is a human being who is just as valuable in the eyes of their creator. And there's so many people here ready and willing to help you, ready and willing to do what needs to be done so that that child has a life and that you have a life. But there's a decision you have to make on your side to take that first step of say, I'm going to choose life. I'm going to be for life. And that there's help here ready and available.
And Josiah, when it comes to the topic specifically of abortion survivors, like we said, there are a lot more than people may realize. Is there anything that you would like to see the pro-life movement in general do better at, highlight more, or any messaging, anything that you think would be a better way to represent your story?
Yeah, I mean, I think the greatest things the pro-life movement can do right now is abortion survivors are being found and are stepping forward is to push them forward, highlight those stories, advocate for those stories, and hold them up and show them the humanity of the situation, show the humanity of the unborn, because many are surviving, but so many more are lost. And every abortion survivor we see walking around is living testimony to the humanity of the unborn. And I think about just like when we talk about slavery, when we talk about the Holocaust, all those sorts of things, some of the most moving parts of that was to show the reality of that, to show their survivors, to show what they went through, to highlight their stories, to share their stories so that we don't repeat those mistakes, so that we don't repeat those atrocities and those wrongs. And so I think it's important that we do that with abortion survivors as well. One of the beautiful things about what it means to be pro-life, like even if in all your work, all your conversations, even if you only impact one life, that still was worthwhile. That still was meaningful. Why? Because that one life still matters. That one human being is valuable, and it's worthwhile to even impact just the one, because that one matters.
Absolutely. Well, Josiah, thank you so much for coming on, sharing your story, sharing your insight with us. It's been a blessing.
Thank you.
Hearing Josiah's story today has been a good encouragement to me. And, you know, Josiah is far from alone when it comes to surviving abortion. Like we said, far more people survive the attempt on their life than what most realize. And we have those resources, we have examples, and we try to share their stories on our website, lifeissues.org. You can go there and you can learn more about this important topic, and you can share that with your friends, your family members, and your church community, as together we fight to defend all human life. Again, that's available at our website, lifeissues.org. Be sure to tune in next week for another Straight Talk on Life Issues.